From Book 21 of Ab Urbe Condita by Livy, chapters 30 through 38. Accordingly, Hannibal, having settled in his own mind to go forward and advance on Italy, called the soldiers together and worked on their feelings with alternate chiding and encouragement. He marveled, he said, what sudden terror had invaded breasts that had ever been dauntless. For these many years they had been victorious in war, nor had they quitted Spain until all the tribes and territories which lay between two distant seas were in the power of the Carthaginians. Then, indignant that the Roman people should demand that whoever had laid siege to Saguntum be surrendered up to them, as though to expedite a felony, they had crossed the Ebro in order to wipe out the Roman name and liberate the world. The march had not then seemed long to any of them, though they meant to advance from the setting to the rising sun. But now, when they could see that they had measured off the greater part of it, when they had made their way through the fiercest tribes over the Pyrenees, when they had crossed the Rhone, that mighty river, in the teeth of so many thousand Gauls, overcoming too the violence of the stream itself, when the Alps, the other side of which was in Italy, were in full sight, were they halting now, as though exhausted, at the very gates of their enemies? What else did they think that the Alps were but high mountains? They might fancy them higher than the ranges of the Pyrenees, but surely no lands touched the skies or were impassable to men. The Alps indeed were inhabited, were tilled, produced and supported living beings. Their defiles were practicable for armies. Those very ambassadors whom they beheld had not crossed the Alps in the air on wings. Even the ancestors of these men had not been natives of Italy, but had lived there as foreign settlers, and had often crossed these very Alps in great companies with their children and their wives in the manner of immigrants. For armed soldiers, taking nothing with them but the instruments of war, what could be impassable or insurmountable? To capture Saguntum, what dangers or what hardships had they not endured for 8 long months? Now that Rome, the capital of the world, was their objective, could anything seem so painful or so difficult as to delay their enterprise? Had Gauls once captured that which the Phoenician despaired of approaching, then let them yield in spirit and manhood to a race which they had so often vanquished in the course of the last few days, or look to end their march in the field that lay between the Tiber and the walls of Rome. After encouraging them with this exhortation, he bade them refresh themselves and make ready for the march. Setting out on the following day, he advanced up the Rhone toward the interior of Gaul, not that it was the more direct way to the Alps, but believing that the further he retired from the sea, the less likely he was to fall in with the Romans, with whom he had no mind to fight a battle until he should arrive in Italy. The 4th day's march brought him to the island. There the rivers Isera and Rhone, rushing down from different Alps, unite their waters, after enclosing a considerable territory, and the island is the name which has been given to the plains lying between them. Near by is the country of the Allobroges, a tribe, even at that very day, inferior to no Gallic tribe in wealth or reputation. Just then it was prey to discord. 2 brothers were disputing the sovereignty. The elder, Branius by name, who held sway before, was being driven out by a faction of juniors headed by the younger brother, whose right was less but his might greater. This quarrel having very opportunely been referred to Hannibal for settlement, who thus became arbiter of the kingdom, he espoused the sentiments of the Senate and the leading men, and restored the sovereign power to the elder. In requital of this service he was assisted with provisions and supplies of every sort, particularly clothing, which the notorious cold of the Alps made it necessary to provide. Having settled the contentions of the Allobroges, Hannibal was now ready for the Alps, but instead of marching directly towards them, he turned to the left, to the country of the Tricastini, and thence proceeded through the outer borders of the territory of the Vocontii to the Tricorii, by a road which nowhere presented any difficulties, until he came to the Druentia. This, too, is an Alpine river, and by far the most difficult of all the rivers of Gaul to cross, for, Though it brings down a vast volume of water, it does not admit of navigation, since, not being confined within any banks, but flowing at once in several channels not always the same, it is ever forming new shallows and new pools, a fact which makes it dangerous for foot passengers as well, besides which it rolls down jagged stones and affords no sure or stable footing to one who enters it. And at that time, as it happened, it was swollen with rains, and the crossing took place amidst the wildest tumult. For the men, besides their own other difficulties, were confused by their own excitement in bewildered outcries. Publius Cornelius the consul, some 3 days after Hannibal had left the bank of the Rhone, marched in fighting order to the enemy's camp, intending to offer battle without delay. But finding the works deserted, and perceiving that he could not readily overtake the enemy, who had got so long a start of him, he returned to the sea, where he had left his ships, thinking that he would thus be more safely and easily enabled to confront Hannibal as he descended from the Alps. Still, that he might not leave Spain stripped of Roman defenders, for the law had assigned it to him as his province, he sent Cneius Scipio, his brother, with the chief part of his troops to deal with Hasdrubal, with the object not merely of protecting the allies and of winning over new ones, but also of driving Hasdrubal out of Spain. He himself, with extremely scanty forces, sailed back to Genoa, proposing to safeguard Italy with the army which lay in the valley of the Po. Hannibal, leaving the Druentia and advancing for the most part through a champaign country, reached the Alps without being molested by the Gauls who inhabited the region. Then, though report, which is wont to exaggerate uncertain dangers, had already taught them what to expect, still, the near view of the lofty mountains, with their snows almost merging in the sky, the shapeless hovels perched on crags, the frost-bitten flocks and beasts of burden, the shaggy, unkempt men, animals and inanimate objects alike stiff with cold, and all more dreadful to look upon than words can tell, renewed their consternation. As their column began to mount the first slopes, mountaineers were discovered posted on the heights above, who, had they lain concealed in hidden valleys, might have sprung out suddenly and attacked them with great rout and slaughter. Hannibal gave the command to halt, and sent forward some Gauls to reconnoitre. When informed by them that there was no getting by that way, he encamped in the most extensive valley to be found in a wilderness of rocks and precipices. He then employed these same Gauls, whose speech and custom did not differ greatly from those of the mountaineers, to mingle in their councils, and in this way learned that his enemies guarded the pass only by day, and at night dispersed, every man to his own home. As soon as it was light, he advanced up the hills, as though he hoped to rush the defile by an open attack in the daytime. Then, having spent the day in feigning a purpose other than his real one, he entrenched a camp on the spot where he halted. But no sooner did he perceive that the mountaineers had dispersed from the heights and relaxed their vigilance, than, leaving for show more fires than numbers of those who remained in camp demanded, leaving, too, the baggage and the cavalry and a great part of the infantry, he put himself at the head of some light-armed soldiers, all his bravest men, and, marching swiftly to the head of the defile, occupied those very heights which the enemy had held. With the ensuing dawn the Carthaginians broke camp, and the remainder of their army began to move. The natives, on a signal being given, were already coming in from their fastnesses to occupy their customary post, when they suddenly perceived that some of their enemies were in possession of the heights and threatened them from above, and that others were marching through the pass. Both facts presenting themselves at the same time to their eyes and minds kept them for a moment rooted to the spot. Then, when they saw the helter-skelter in the pass, and the column becoming embarrassed by its own confusion, the horses especially being frightened and unmanageable, they thought that whatever they could add themselves to the consternation of the troops would be sufficient to destroy them, and rushed down from the cliffs on either side, over trails and trackless ground alike, with all the ease of habit. Then indeed the Phoenicians had to contend at once and at the same time against their foes in the difficulties of the ground, and the struggle amongst themselves, as each endeavoured to outstrip the rest in escaping from the danger, was greater than the struggle with the enemy. The horses occasioned the greatest peril to the column. Terrified by the discordant yells which the woods and ravines redoubled with their echoes, they quaked with fear, and if they happened to be hit or wounded, were so maddened that they made enormous havoc, not only of the men, but of every sort of baggage. Indeed, the crowding in the pass, which was steep and precipitous on both sides, caused many, some of them armed men, to be flung down to a great depth. But when beasts of burden with their packs went hurtling down, it was just like the crash of falling walls. Dreadful as these sights were, still Hannibal halted for a little while and held back his men, so as not to augment the terror and confusion. Then, when he saw that the column was being broken in two, and there was danger lest he might have got his army over to no avail if it were stripped of its baggage, he charged down from the higher ground and routed the enemy by the very impetus of the attack, though he added to the disorder amongst his own troops. But the flurry thus occasioned quickly subsided as soon as the roads were cleared by the flight of the mountaineers, and the whole army was presently brought over the pass, not only without molestation, but almost in silence. Hannibal then seized a stronghold, which was the chief place in the region, together with the outlying hamlets, with the captured food and flocks supported his troops for 3 days. And in those 3 days, being hindered neither by the natives, who had been utterly cowed at the onset, nor very greatly by the nature of the country, he covered a good deal of ground. They came next to another canton, thickly settled for a mountain district. There, not by open fighting, but by his own devices, trickery, and deception, Hannibal was all but circumvented. The elder headmen of the strongholds waited on him as a deputation, and said that, taught by other men's misfortunes, a useful warning, they preferred to experience the friendship of the Phoenicians rather than their might. They were ready, therefore, to carry out his orders, and they requested him to accept provisions and guides, and also hostages, as a guarantee of good faith. Hannibal, neither blindly trusting nor yet repulsing them, lest, being spurned, they might become openly hostile, returned a friendly answer, accepted the proffered hostages, and used the supplies which they had brought down themselves to the road. But he drew up his column before following their guides, by no means as though for a march through friendly country. The van was made up of elephants and cavalry. He himself, with the main strength of the infantry, came next, looking warily about him and watching everything. When they had got to a narrow place, which was overhung on one side by a ridge, the tribesmen rose up on every quarter from their ambush and assailed them, front and rear, fighting hand to hand and at long range, and rolling down huge boulders on the marching troops. The rear guard bore the brunt of the attack, and as the infantry faced about to meet it, it was very evident that if the column had not been strengthened at that point, it must have suffered a great disaster in this pass. Even so, they were in the utmost peril and came near destruction. For while Hannibal was hesitating to send his division down into the defile, since he had no troops left to secure the rear of the infantry, as he himself secured that of his horse, the mountaineers rushed in on his flank, and breaking through the column, established themselves in the road, so that Hannibal spent one night without cavalry or baggage. On the following day, since by now the barbarians were attacking with less vigor, his forces were reunited and surmounted the pass, and though they suffered some casualties, still they lost more baggage animals than men. From this point on the mountaineers appeared in smaller numbers, and, more in the manner of brigandage than warfare, attacked sometimes the van, sometimes the rear, whenever the ground afforded an advantage, or the invaders, pushing on too far ahead or lagging behind, gave opportunity. The elephants could be induced to move but very slowly along the steep and narrow trails, but wherever they went they made the column safe from its enemies, who were unaccustomed to the beasts and afraid of venturing too near them. On the 9th day they arrived at the summit of the Alps, having come for the most part over trackless wastes and by roundabout routes, owing either to the dishonesty of their guides, or, when they would not trust the guides, to their blindly entering some valley, guessing at the way. For 2 days they lay encamped at the summit. The soldiers, worn with toil and fighting, were permitted to rest, and a number of baggage animals which had fallen among the rocks made their way to the camp by following the tracks of the army. Exhausted and discouraged as the soldiers were by many hardships and a snowstorm, for the constellation of Pleiades was now setting, threw them into a great fear. The ground was everywhere covered deep with snow, when at dawn they began to march, and as the column moved slowly on, dejection and despair were to be read in every countenance. Then Hannibal, who had gone on before the standards, made the army halt on a certain promontory which commanded an extensive prospect, and pointing out Italy to them, just under the Alps, the plains about the Po, he told them that they were now scaling the ramparts, not only of Italy, but of Rome itself. The rest of the way would be level or downhill, and after one, or at the most two battles, they would have in their hands and in their power the citadel and capital of Italy. The column now began to make some progress, and even the enemy had ceased to annoy them, except to make a stealthy raid as occasion offered. But the way was much more difficult than the ascent had been, as indeed the slope of the Alps on the Italian side is in general more precipitous in proportion as it is shorter. For practically every road was steep, narrow, and treacherous, so that neither could they keep from slipping, nor could those who had been thrown off a little by their balance retain their footing, but came down one on top of the other, and the beasts on top of the men. Then they came to a much narrower cliff, with rocks so perpendicular that it was difficult for an unencumbered soldier to manage the descent, though he felt his way and clung with his hands to the bushes and roots that projected here and there. The place had been precipitous before, and a recent landslip had carried it away to the depth of a good 1,000 feet. There the cavalry came to a halt, as though they had reached the end of the road, and as Hannibal was wondering what it could be that held the column back, word was brought to him that the cliff was impassable. Going then to inspect the place himself, he thought that there was nothing for it but to lead the army round, over trackless and untrodden steppes. But that way proved to be insuperable, for above the old, untouched snow lay a fresh deposit of moderate depth, through which, as it was soft and not very deep, the men in front found it easy to advance. But when it had been trampled down by the feet of so many men and beasts, the rest had to make their way over the bare ice beneath in the slush of the melting snow. Then came a terrible struggle on the slippery surface, for it afforded them no foothold, while the downward slope made their feet the more quickly slide from under them, so that whether they tried to pull themselves up with their hands or used their knees, these supports themselves would slip, and down they would come again. Neither were there any stems or roots about by which a man could pull himself up with hand or foot, only smooth ice and thawing snow, on which they were continually rolling. But the baggage animals, as they went over the snow, would sometimes even cut into the lowest crust, and pitching forward and striking out with their hoofs as they struggled to rise, would break clean through it, so that numbers of them were caught fast, as if entrapped in the hard, deep frozen snow. At last, when men and beasts had been worn out to no avail, they encamped upon the ridge, after having, with the utmost difficulty, cleared enough ground even for this purpose. So much snow were they obliged to dig out and remove. The soldiers were then sent to work to construct a road across the cliff, their only possible way. Since they had cut through the rock, they felled some huge trees that grew near at hand, and lopping off their branches, made an enormous pile of logs. This they set on fire as soon as the wind blew fresh enough to make it burn, and pouring vinegar over the glowing rocks, caused them to crumble. After thus heating the crag with fire, they opened a way in it with iron tools, and relieved the steepness of the slope with zigzags of an easy gradient, so that not only could the baggage animals, but even the elephants, could be led down. 4 days they were consumed at the cliff, and the animals nearly perished of starvation, for the mountain tops are all practically bare, and such grass as does grow is buried under snow. Lower down one comes to valleys and sunny slopes and rivulets, and near them woods, and places that begin to be fitter for man's habitation. There the beasts were turned out to graze, and the men, exhausted with toiling at the road, were allowed to rest. Thence they descended in 3 days' time into the plains, through a region now that was less forbidding, as it was the character of the inhabitants. Such were the chief features of the march to Italy, which they accomplished in 5 months after leaving New Carthage, as certain authorities state, having crossed the Alps in 15 days. The strength of Hannibal's forces on his entering Italy is a point on which historians are by no means agreed. Those who put the figures highest give him 100,000 foot and 20,000 horse; the lowest estimate is 20,000 foot and 6,000 horse.